The workshop in Bermondsey smelled of linseed oil and slate dust that September morning, a combination our craftsman had breathed for so many years it had become the very essence of home. He was bent over his workbench, planing a piece of Brazilian rosewood to perfect smoothness, when his sister Margaret entered with that particular rustle of skirts that meant news. "Special messenger," she announced, holding an envelope of cream-colored paper that seemed to glow against the workshop's honest grime. The letter bore the Ashworth crest, and our master's fingers, so steady when handling the most delicate adjustments, trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Lord Ashworth required his immediate attention regarding a matter of extreme delicacy concerning the billiard table at Ashworth Hall. The fee mentioned was generous enough to make Margaret gasp when she read over his shoulder.
3 months' worth of ordinary work, he calculated silently, for what his lordship calls a few days' consultation. The arithmetic of necessity was one he knew well. The workshop's rent was due. Materials were growing dearer with each passing month, and Margaret deserved better than keeping accounts for her bachelor brother at 38 years of age. The train journey to Surrey provided our craftsman with time for observation and reflection. England was changing beneath the wheels of progress. Telegraph poles marched alongside the tracks like an army of modern centurions, and the countryside bore fresh scars where new branch lines were being cut. He watched a group of navvies working on an embankment, their faces grimy with honest labor, and felt a kinship with these men who shaped the physical world with their hands. In his worn leather satchel, he carried his essential tools. The German-made level his father had left him, micrometers, gauges, and a small volume of Marcus Aurelius that had belonged to the same departed parent. "What we cannot bear removes us from life," he had underlined on page 43. Though our master wondered if the emperor had ever contemplated the particular burden of serving men who had never calibrated anything more complex than their own comfort. Margaret had seen him off with uncharacteristic fuss, adjusting his collar twice and reminding him about Mr. Peterson, the clockmaker from Walworth, who had begun calling on Thursday evenings. "He's a good man," she'd said, not meeting his eyes. "Steady work, owns his shop outright." Our craftsman had noticed the color in her cheeks when Peterson's name arose, the first such bloom he'd seen since their father's death 26 years ago. The Surrey countryside unfolded beyond the window. Neat hedgerows and autumn fields where the last of the harvest was being taken in. He observed a gentleman in a dog cart directing laborers with a riding crop, never dismounting to examine the work himself, and our master's hands unconsciously flexed, remembering the satisfaction of solving problems through direct touch and measurement. Ashworth Hall announced itself first through a gradual improvement in the roads, then ornamental gates that seemed designed more to impress than defend. The estate spread across the landscape like something from a painting, too perfect to be entirely trusted. Our craftsmen had learned long ago that the most beautiful surfaces often concealed the deepest flaws, a lesson taught by every table that looked magnificent until you set a level upon it. The approach to the great house took him past gardens where late roses still bloomed despite the season's advancement. A young footman watched from an upper window, his face bearing that particular mixture of curiosity and caution that marked the ambitious servant. Below, a housemaid shook out linens with violent efficiency, as if beating honesty into the very fabric. Mr. Hartley, the estate manager, met him at the servants' entrance, a calculated reminder of social stations that our craftsman accepted with the same equanimity he brought to discovering warped slate. Hartley was a nervous man of 45 years, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested constant anxiety about appearances. His handshake was damp despite the cool air. "You've come about the table," Hartley said, though it wasn't really a question. "His lordship is most anxious for discretion." Discretion, our master thought, that expensive commodity the wealthy purchase along with everything else. Aloud, he merely nodded, following Hartley through passages that smelled of beeswax and carefully maintained hierarchy. Portraits of previous Ashworths gazed down with the serene confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world's machinery. The billiard room, when they reached it, was a shrine to calculated leisure, wood paneling that absorbed sound and light, creating an atmosphere of permanent dusk even in midday. The table itself stood in the center like an altar, its green baize pristine, its cushions the color of old money. "His lordship will explain the situation this evening," Hartley said. "You're to examine the table thoroughly. Your room has been prepared in the servants' wing." Lord Ashworth received our craftsmen in the library that evening, a room where leather-bound volumes stood like soldiers of knowledge, most having never faced the battlefield of actual reading. His lordship was 58 years of age, with the kind of weathered authority that colonial administration stamps upon a man's features. He poured brandy without offering any, another reminder of respective positions, and began his tale. "The table is cursed," Lord Ashworth declared, with the tone of someone who despised such nonsense, yet couldn't deny the evidence. "Or so my guests believe." The story emerged in fits and starts, like water through a partially blocked pipe. Major Pelham, a cavalry officer who had gambled away his commission money in that very room in 1871, had taken his service revolver and ended his troubles against the north wall. The stain, Lord Ashworth noted with distaste, had required replacing an entire panel. "Since then," his lordship continued, "players swear the balls change direction mid-roll. Impossible shots succeed. Certain pots fail. Last week, Captain Blackwood lost 500 pounds when his final black inexplicably curved away from a pocket it was heading straight toward." Our master listened with the patience of someone accustomed to clients who described problems in emotional rather than mechanical terms. A table cannot be dishonest, he thought, only those who play upon it. But he kept this observation behind his teeth, where wisdom suggested it belonged. The next morning brought October's crisp clarity, and with it, our craftsman's systematic examination began. He worked alone in the billiard room, the morning light revealing dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. His German level, precise to degrees most men couldn't imagine, showed the slate bed to be remarkably true, a testament to the original installer's skill. Young Thomas, the Welsh footman he'd glimpsed yesterday, brought tea without being asked. The boy, for at 19 he was little more, lingered with obvious fascination as our master worked. "My da worked with his hands too," Thomas offered, his accent carrying the mountains of Wales despite his efforts to smooth it into English respectability. "Coalface for 20 years before the shaft collapsed." Our craftsman recognized the hunger in the young man's eyes, not for food, but for something larger than service, something that might lift him beyond carrying trays and saying, "Yes, my lord." It was a hunger he'd seen in his own mirror at that age. The examination continued with methodical precision. Every cushion tested for consistency, every pocket measured for regulation dimensions. The table was, by every metric available to his considerable expertise, perfect,
Yet perfection itself aroused suspicion. Nothing in this fallen world achieved such a state without help. Captain Blackwood arrived after luncheon, sweeping into the billiard room with the casual ownership of someone who belonged everywhere by birthright. At 34, he maintained the kind of athletic handsomeness that made both horses and women nervous. Our master noticed how the captain's eyes immediately went to the table, then to him, calculating something behind their practiced charm. "Still searching for our ghost?" Blackwood asked, with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Poor Pelham. They say he appears when someone's about to lose catastrophically." The captain insisted on demonstrating the table's peculiarities, setting up shots with practiced ease. Our craftsman watched not the balls, but the man, how his weight shifted, where his eyes went when he thought himself unobserved. Every liar has a tell, his father had taught him, just like every warped board has a place where it first began to bend. Sarah, the housemaid, entered to tend the fire, moving with the deliberate invisibility that good servants cultivate. But our master caught her watching Captain Blackwood with an expression that suggested knowledge held in reserve. At 23, she had the kind of sharp intelligence that service couldn't entirely suppress. "Been strange happenings, even when the room's empty," she volunteered when the captain had gone. "Noises from below at odd hours. Mr. Hartley says it's the wine cellar settling. But wine don't settle at 2 in the morning, does it?" That evening, our craftsman wrote to Margaret by lamplight, his careful script reporting progress while avoiding details that might worry her. He mentioned Peterson only briefly, noting that clockwork and billiard tables shared a need for precision, a comparison he hoped would please them both. The letter felt like a connection to an honest world, one where mechanisms obeyed natural laws without supernatural intervention. But as he sealed the envelope, a sound from the billiard room drew his attention. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being carefully moved. By the time he reached the corridor, only silence greeted him. The room stood empty, gaslight casting familiar shadows, yet something had changed. A ball on the table, the white, sat precisely in the center of the balk line, though he was certain he'd left all balls in their wooden triangle. Ghost or man, he wondered. Someone wants me to know I'm being watched. The morning of October 4th brought rain that drummed against the windows like impatient fingers, and our craftsman began his deeper investigation. He'd spent the night considering the moved cue ball, that small declaration of interest from someone in the household. Now, with methodical precision, he prepared to strip the table to its bones. The baize came away under his careful hands like skin from fruit, revealing the slate beneath. 3 perfectly matched pieces of Welsh slate, blue-gray and smooth as still water. He ran his fingers across the surface, feeling for imperfections that eyes might miss. The human hand, he'd learned through decades of work, could detect variations of less than 1/1000th of an inch. Mr. Hartley appeared in the doorway, wringing his hands with the nervous energy that seemed his permanent condition. "His lordship inquires about progress," he said, though our master suspected the inquiry was Hartley's own anxious invention. "Tell his lordship that perfection takes time to prove false," our craftsman replied, continuing his examination without looking up. The estate manager lingered, clearly wanting to say more, but lacking the words, or perhaps the courage. Finally, he retreated, leaving only the scent of his pomade and anxiety. It was while checking the slate joints that our master's fingers found the first anomaly, not in the slate itself, but beneath it, a slight ridge that shouldn't exist. He worked his thinnest blade into the gap, feeling resistance that spoke of recent disturbance. Someone had been here before him, someone skilled enough to leave almost no trace. Captain Blackwood's voice from the doorway made our craftsman glad his back was turned, hiding his expression of discovery. "Performing surgery on our patient?" The captain entered with his usual proprietary air, today accompanied by the smell of Turkish tobacco and what might have been gin, despite the early hour. He circled the exposed table like a cavalryman examining a horse, all surface observation, without real understanding. "My wife writes that Bath is lovely this season," Blackwood mentioned casually, though our master heard the edge beneath the words. "Much more peaceful than London. Or Surrey." A man who keeps his wife at distance, our craftsman thought, usually has reasons beyond the obvious. He made a noncommittal sound and continued working, aware that Blackwood watched him with increasing intensity. After the captain departed, Sarah arrived with fresh cloths and water. She moved with purpose, but kept stealing glances at the stripped table, as if seeing it naked revealed secrets she'd only suspected. "My gran used to say that every house has its bones," she offered quietly. "And bones remember everything." Our craftsman considered this piece of folk wisdom while she worked. The girl had the kind of observational intelligence that made her dangerous to those with secrets. Perhaps why she remained a housemaid, despite capabilities that suggested more. "The wine cellar," he asked carefully, "directly below us. Is it much used?" Sarah's hand stilled for just a moment. "Mr. Hartley keeps the key, says the temperature needs careful monitoring. Checks it himself most nights, sometimes with help." That afternoon, while the household observed the ritual of tea, our master made his most significant discovery. Lifting one section of slate with the careful leverage of boards and pulleys he'd arranged, he found beneath it not the usual rough wooden support frame, but something far more sophisticated. A mesh of fine copper wire, almost invisible unless one knew to look, stretched across the entire understructure. It had been installed with remarkable skill, woven between the original supports like a metal spider's web. Copper conducts, his mind supplied immediately. But conducts what? He replaced everything carefully, ensuring no sign of his discovery remained. The bays would need replacing anyway, his stated reason for being here, giving him legitimate cause to return to this exact spot. But now he understood he was dealing with something far more complex than superstition or simple trickery. Young Thomas found him in the servants' hall that evening, approaching with the mixture of deference and determination that marked the ambitious poor. "My father," the boy said quietly, he understood machines, the pit engines, the pumps, said every machine has a purpose, even if you can't see it straight off. Our craftsman studied the young man's earnest face, seeing intelligence constrained by circumstance. "And what purpose do you serve here, Thomas?" "Whatever's required," came the reply. But the boy's eyes suggested deeper currents. "Mr. Hartley's been teaching me accounts, says I have a head for numbers." Everyone here, our master reflected later in his small room, seems to be playing a game whose rules I'm only beginning to understand. He opened his Marcus Aurelius, seeking wisdom in ancient words, but found himself thinking instead of modern innovations, electricity, magnetism, the invisible forces that the new century was learning to harness. Tomorrow he would need new bays, a perfect excuse to visit the suppliers in the village. But more importantly, he needed to understand what force could act through copper mesh to influence ivory and composition balls on the table above. The village of Ashworth lay 2 miles from the estate, a journey our craftsmen made on foot through lanes still muddy from yesterday's rain. October 5th had dawned clear but cold, the kind of morning that made England feel ancient and permanent, though he knew better than to trust such impressions. The supplier's shop occupied a narrow building squeezed between a bakery and an undertaker's establishment. Life's necessities and its ultimate certainty pressed close together. Mr. Dobson, the proprietor, greeted our master with the respect one tradesman shows another who pays promptly and knows quality from dross. "Best West of England cloth," Dobson proclaimed, unrolling a bolt of baize so green it seemed to capture all of summer. "Though I hear strange things about the Hall's table." Our craftsman ran the cloth between thumb and forefinger, feeling for consistency of weave while keeping his expression neutral. In his experience, suppliers often knew more about great houses than their inhabitants suspected. "Strange times all around," Dobson continued, warming to gossip as he measured and cut. "That new electrical station they're building near London, unnatural, some say. Though Lord Ashworth's very keen on progress, installed electric bells last year." Electric bells, our master noted, filing this information alongside his discovery of the copper mesh. The modern world was threading itself through ancient estates like those copper wires through wood. On his return, he encountered Mrs. Blackwood's letter arriving by special messenger. The captain received it in the entrance hall, his face darkening as he read. Our craftsman, passing through with his bundle of baize, heard only fragments, unable to continue. "Resources exhausted. Mother's house." The captain crumpled the letter with violence that suggested practice, then noticed our master's presence. "Domestic correspondence," he said with a laugh sharp as broken glass. "Women never understand the complexity of a man's obligations." That afternoon, while stretching new baize across the slate with the patience of someone who knew that hurrying meant imperfection, our craftsman pondered the nature of obligation. His hands worked automatically, decades of practice guiding them while his mind wandered through more complex territories. The copper mesh beneath seemed to pulse with potential, though he knew this was imagination rather than sensation. A letter from Margaret had been waiting in his room. Peterson had proposed, formally and properly, offering not just marriage but partnership in his business. "Two craftsmen," she wrote, "understanding precision and patience." Our master felt an unexpected pang, realizing that his sister's life might soon diverge from his own after 22 years of shared household. Mr. Hartley interrupted these reflections, entering with Lord Ashworth himself. His lordship examined the half-finished surface with the suspicious attention of someone who trusted nothing and no one completely. "The original cloth lasted 15 years, Lord Ashworth observed. "I trust this will prove equally durable." "Durability depends on treatment, my lord," our craftsman replied, stretching the baize with minute adjustments. "Even the finest cloth fails under adverse conditions." His lordship's eyes sharpened at this, perhaps hearing criticism where only observation was intended. But before he could respond, young Thomas appeared with urgent news. There had been an accident in the wine cellar, a shelf collapsed, bottles broken. Hartley went pale beneath his pomade, excusing himself with haste that confirmed our master's suspicions about the importance of that lower room. Lord Ashworth followed more slowly, commanding our craftsman to continue his work undisturbed. Alone again, Our master worked with deliberate slowness, straining to hear activity below. Footsteps, muffled voices, and once, distinctly, the sound of something heavy being dragged across stone. The wine cellar, it seemed, contained more than vintage port. Sarah appeared as evening approached, ostensibly to tend the fire, but clearly bursting with information. 3 dozen bottles of the 1860 vintage destroyed, she reported, with the satisfaction of someone who knew the value of such loss. Mr. Hartley nearly wept, though funny thing, the shelf that fell was nearly new, installed just this summer. She arranged the coals with unnecessary vigor, adding, Thomas says he heard humming from down there last week. Like a great bee trapped in a bottle. But Mr. Hartley said it was his imagination. Humming, our craftsman thought, his hands never pausing in their work. The sound of electrical current through resistance, perhaps. He'd heard such sounds in London, near the new telegraph offices, where modern magic carried words across impossible distances. That night, he studied his father's notebooks by candlelight, pages yellow with age, but wisdom still sharp. Among observations about wood grain and slate selection, his father had written, "A true craftsman sees not just what is, but what someone wishes to hide." Below this, in pencil added years later, "The greatest skill is knowing when revelation serves justice, and when it merely serves curiosity." Our master closed the notebook, thinking of young Thomas with his ambitious hunger, of Sarah with her sharp observations, of Hartley's nervous hands, and Blackwood's desperate bonhomie. Tomorrow, he decided, he must find a way into that cellar. The copper mesh was only half the mechanism. Below lay its driving force and perhaps the key to understanding who moved the balls on the table above, and why. The October night pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness our craftsman knew someone else was planning their next move in this game where the stakes remained carefully hidden beneath perfectly stretched green baize. The opportunity came unexpectedly on October 7th, when Lord Ashworth departed for London on sudden business regarding his colonial investments. The household exhaled collectively in his absence, like a spring released from pressure, and our craftsman recognized the moment for what it was, a chance to explore without the master's suspicious oversight. Mr. Hartley had been called to the village on estate matters, leaving his keys in his office while dealing with a dispute between tenants. Sarah, who seemed to know everything worth knowing in the household, mentioned this fact while bringing our master's morning tea, her eyes conveying more than her words. 20 minutes, perhaps 30, she said quietly. The dispute involves the Weatherby brothers. They never settle anything quickly. The key ring was exactly where she'd suggested, hanging from a hook behind the door like an invitation to discovery. Our craftsman selected the heavy iron key marked with a cellar symbol, its weight suggesting age and importance. His hands, so steady when adjusting mechanisms to thousandths of an inch, trembled slightly as he descended the servants' stairs toward the lower regions of the house. The wine cellar door stood at the end of a stone corridor that smelled of damp and centuries. The key turned with well-oiled silence, recently maintained, unlike the ancient appearance suggested. Inside, racks of bottles stretched back into shadows, their dust patterns telling stories of which vintages moved and which remained untouched. But it was the new construction that drew his attention immediately. Behind the recent shelving that Sarah had mentioned, barely visible unless one knew to look, stood a wooden partition that shouldn't exist according to the house's original architecture. Our master's practiced eye recognized modern carpentry trying to appear old, the artificial aging of wood that someone had attempted with tea and iron filings. The partition concealed a door, locked with a modern Yale lock that seemed almost obscene against the ancient stones. But our craftsman had learned more than just table repair in his 42 years. His father had taught him that understanding mechanisms meant understanding all mechanisms. The lock yielded to patient manipulation with his finest tools. Behind the door lay answers that exceeded even his suspicious imagination.
The room hummed with barely contained energy, the sound Sarah's sharp ears had caught. Against one wall stood an electrical apparatus that would have seemed at home in a London laboratory. Batteries in glass jars, their acid smell sharp in the enclosed space, connected by rubber-wrapped cables to a control panel of brass switches and dials. So this is our ghost, our master thought, examining the machinery with professional appreciation for its construction, despite his disgust at its purpose. Wires led upward through carefully drilled holes in the ceiling, directly beneath the billiard room. The copper mesh he'd discovered was merely the visible part of an electromagnetic system that could, he realized, influence any ferrous material above. A chart tacked to the wall showed the billiard table drawn from below, with positions marked and numbered. Beside it, in Hartley's nervous handwriting, notes about optimal activation points and sufficient charge for deflection. Another hand, bolder and careless, had added gambling odds and figures that suggested significant winnings. Our craftsman heard footsteps above, someone walking in the billiard room with measured pace. He quickly memorized what he could, noting particularly a schedule of events that corresponded to dates when, he suspected, particular games had been influenced. Captain Blackwood's name appeared frequently, though whether as beneficiary or victim remained unclear. Young Thomas's voice echoed down suddenly from the corridor above, warning about Mr. Hartley's early return. Our master moved swiftly but carefully, ensuring everything remained as he'd found it. The locks clicked back into place just as Hartley's agitated tones became audible from the entrance. Back in the billiard room, our craftsman continued his methodical work on the table's surface, his mind processing what he'd discovered, while his hands maintained their steady rhythm. The electromagnetic apparatus explained the mechanism, but not the full conspiracy. Who operated it during games? Who chose the victims? Who collected the winnings? That evening, Captain Blackwood appeared with Mr. Cornelius Webb, the local magistrate. Webb was a man of 62 years, with the kind of careful dignity that suggested authority earned rather than inherited. He examined the nearly completed table with genuine appreciation. "Beautiful work," Webb observed. "My father was a carpenter. Always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated wood and wool." The captain laughed, too loudly. "Then we're all being judged tonight, eh, Webb?" Our craftsman noticed how Blackwood's eyes kept shifting to the floor, as if he could see through to the room below. The captain knew about the apparatus, that much was certain. But was he its master or its servant? A letter from Margaret arrived with the Evening Post, her happiness evident in every line. Peterson had begun preparing a room above his shop for her, she wrote, installing new windows for better light. He says a craftsman's wife deserves to see her work clearly, she added, and our master felt both joy for his sister and a hollow understanding that his own life would soon be emptier. Perhaps, he reflected while preparing for bed, that is why I pursue this mystery with such determination, not just for justice or truth, but because solving puzzles had become his substitute for deeper human connections. The electromagnetic apparatus below was a problem he could understand, unlike the complex mechanisms of the heart that left him baffled at 42. The finished table gleamed under gaslight that evening of October 8th. Its new base stretched perfect as still water.
Our craftsman ran his hand across the surface one final time, feeling for imperfections that didn't exist, while his mind worked through the puzzle of the apparatus below. The technical achievement impressed him, even as its purpose repelled. Someone had married modern electrical science to ancient deception with remarkable skill. Lord Ashworth had returned from London in a foul mood, something about colonial railways and disappointing returns. He inspected the restored table with the suspicious attention of a man who trusted nothing, running his own hands across the baize as if our master might have somehow introduced new irregularities. "There's to be a game tonight," his lordship announced. "Several gentlemen from the county. You'll remain available should any adjustments prove necessary." The dismissal was clear, but our craftsman had learned that the best position for observation was often from the edges where one became furniture, noticed only when needed. He stationed himself in the serving corridor, where he could glimpse the billiard room through the door's narrow opening, while ostensibly checking his tools. The gentlemen arrived after dinner, voices loosened by port and brandy. Captain Blackwood led them in with his usual excessive bonhomie, joking about the table's reputation. Mr. Webb, the magistrate, followed more soberly, along with two men our master didn't recognize, a railway investor named Pemberton and a younger fellow introduced as Mr. Ashford, his lordship's nephew down from Cambridge. £50 a frame, Blackwood suggested with studied casualness. "Unless that's too rich for university blood?" Young Ashford laughed nervously. The sum would represent months of allowance for a student, our craftsman calculated, remembering his own youth, when 50 shillings had seemed a fortune. But the boy's pride was engaged now, that particular weakness of the privileged young who feared seeming poor more than becoming so. The games began ordinarily enough. Our master watched through his narrow vantage, noting how the balls behaved exactly as physics demanded. But he also observed Captain Blackwood's movements, the way he positioned himself at specific spots, how his feet shifted in what seemed nervous energy, but might be signals. Then, during the third frame, it happened. Young Ashford had lined up a simple pot, the kind of shot that builds confidence. The white rolled true toward the red, the angle perfect, until it wasn't. A subtle curve, barely perceptible unless one was watching for it, sent the white sliding past its target. The young man's face showed confusion, then embarrassment, as Blackwood commiserated with false sympathy. "The table's ghost strikes again," the captain declared, though our craftsman noticed he was standing precisely over one of the positions marked on the chart in the cellar room. From below came the faintest vibration, felt rather than heard. Someone was operating the apparatus, sending electromagnetic pulses through the copper mesh to influence balls that must contain iron filings or steel cores, specially made to appear normal while being susceptible to magnetic fields. Our master's respect for the technical achievement warred with disgust at its application. Young Thomas appeared in the corridor carrying a tray of fresh glasses. He paused near our craftsman, whispering urgently, "Mr. Hartley's in his office, but I saw light from under the wine cellar door." So Hartley wasn't the operator. Someone else controlled the mechanism while the estate manager maintained his alibi above. The conspiracy expanded in our master's understanding like ripples on water. He nodded thanks to Thomas, whose ambition to rise might yet serve justice, though the boy couldn't know it. The games continued, young Ashford losing steadily as the ghost seemed particularly interested in his shots. Mr. Webb played with mechanical precision, showing neither elation in victory nor despair in defeat, a magistrate's careful neutrality. But our craftsman noticed him watching Blackwood with increasing attention, those legal eyes cataloging behavior as evidence. By 11 o'clock, young Ashford had lost 200 pounds he certainly didn't possess. His face had gone from red to pale, the transformation from embarrassed youth to frightened boy complete. He excused himself abruptly, nearly running from the room, and our master heard him being sick in the garden afterward, the body's revolt against catastrophic loss. "Poor pup," Blackwood commented with satisfaction, poorly disguised as sympathy. "Some men aren't meant for serious play." Lord Ashworth said nothing, but his expression suggested calculation. Whether of his nephew's debt or Blackwood's character remained unclear. The evening broke up soon after, the gentlemen dispersing with the subdued air that follows witnessed humiliation. Our craftsman remained in the shadows until the house settled into sleep. Then, moving with purpose, he descended once more toward the cellar. Not to the apparatus room, that secret he would keep until the moment was right, but to examine the wine racks nearest to it. There, among bottles of legitimate vintage, he found what he'd expected, a case of billiard balls, seemingly ordinary, but heavier than standard ivory and composition should be. He selected one, feeling the weight that betrayed its metal core. "Ingenious," he admitted grudgingly. "Switch the regular balls for these before certain games, activate the electromagnetic field at crucial moments, and even skilled players would find their shots betraying them." The perfect crime for an age that worshipped both tradition and progress, using modern science to cheat at England's most gentlemanly game. The morning of October 9th brought revelation through an unexpected source. Our craftsman was examining the altered billiard balls in his room when Sarah knocked with particular urgency. She entered carrying fresh lemons, but immediately abandoned pretense. "You need to know something," she said, closing the door behind her, "about who was in the cellar last night." Our master waited, having learned that Sarah's intelligence came forth more readily without prompting. She twisted the linens between her hands, weighing loyalty against righteousness, a calculation he knew well. "It was Thomas," she finally admitted. "I saw him slip down during the game. But he's not what you think. He's trapped, same as Mr. Hartley." The story emerged in fragments, each more damning than the last. Captain Blackwood had discovered Thomas stealing food from the pantry, not for himself, but for his mother and siblings in Wales, who faced starvation after his father's death in the mine collapse. Instead of dismissal and prosecution, Blackwood had offered an alternative. Operate the electrical apparatus during certain games and receive £5 monthly above his wages. £5, Sarah said bitterly. Enough to keep his family eating, not enough to ever break free. Our craftsman felt the familiar weight of class pressing down like slate on wood. A gentleman's gambling debt was a matter of honor. A footman's theft was a criminal offense. The law, like the billiard table, was only level for those who could afford to play. "And Mr. Hartley?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Blackwood found irregularities in the estate accounts from years back, before Hartley learned proper bookkeeping. Nothing stolen, just mistakes. But try explaining that to Lord Ashworth. So Hartley provides the keys and asks no questions. The mechanism of coercion revealed itself as clearly as the electromagnetic apparatus below. Blackwood, drowning in debt from his cavalry lifestyle and separated wife's expenses, had constructed a perfect trap using others' desperation, as surely as copper wire and electrical current. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the billiard room. Mr. Webb arrived alone, ostensibly to practice his shots, but clearly with deeper purpose. He played a solitary frame while our craftsman pretended to polish the brass corner protectors, both men maintaining the fiction until Webb spoke. "Young Ashford is my godson," the magistrate said quietly, never taking his eyes from the balls. "His father died in India, left very little. The boy's at Cambridge on scholarship and family charity." Our master continued polishing, recognizing confession when he heard it. "Last night's losses will ruin him," Webb continued. "He'll have to leave university, take a clerking position if he's lucky." The magistrate's shot went wide, the first imperfection our craftsman had seen in his play. "I've suspected something wrong here for months. Too many losses, too many ruined men. But suspicion isn't proof. Here, our master thought, was the moment of choice. He could remain the simple tradesman, complete his work, and return to London with Lord Ashworth's generous payment. Or he could step into deeper waters, where working men who challenged gentlemen often drowned. "If there were proof," our craftsman said carefully, "what then?" Webb finally looked at him directly, and in those legal eyes was both hope and calculation. "Then justice might be served, though it would require careful handling. Blackwood has connections, military honors, but fraud is fraud, regardless of accent or commission." Our master made his decision, perhaps influenced by young Thomas's trapped ambition, or Sarah's fierce intelligence, or perhaps by the memory of young Ashford's humiliated flight. "There might be adjustments needed to the table tonight," he said slowly. "Adjustments that could reveal interesting mechanisms." Webb's expression sharpened. "Lord Ashworth hosts another game this evening. Higher stakes. Several London gentlemen are coming specifically because they've heard about our haunted table. Blackwood arranged it, naturally." "Naturally," our craftsman agreed, his mind already working through possibilities. "I'll need certain preparations, and perhaps young Thomas might be convinced that confession serves him better than continued servitude." The magistrate rose to leave, but paused at the door. "My father truly was a carpenter," he said. "He taught me that bent wood can sometimes be straightened, but only with proper pressure applied at the right points." Alone again, our master considered the evening ahead. He had the technical knowledge to expose the mechanism. Webb had the legal authority to ensure consequences, but young Thomas held the key. His testimony could damn Blackwood, or, if the boy chose loyalty to his benefactor over justice, leave them with impressive machinery, but no proof of who commanded its use. He found Thomas in the servants' hall, polishing silver with mechanical precision. The boy's hands shook slightly when our craftsman sat beside him.
"Your father," our master said quietly, "died because mine owners wouldn't spend money on proper safety equipment. Another kind of cheating, wouldn't you say?" Thomas's hands stilled on the silver. "What do you know about it?" "I know that men like Blackwood always find desperate people to do their dirty work, and I know that £5 a month is the price he set on your soul." Our craftsman let that settle before adding, "But what if you could earn your family's salvation honestly? What if the truth served you better than lies?" The young man's face cycled through fear, hope, and calculation, the eternal arithmetic of the powerless. Finally, he whispered, "What would you have me do?" The afternoon of October 10th stretched taut as a freshly pulled baize, and our craftsman worked with deliberate precision in the billiard room. He had convinced Lord Ashworth that minor adjustments were needed. The settling of new cloth, he explained, sometimes required fine calibration. His lordship, distracted by the evening's prospects and the arrival of wealthy London guests, waved him on with impatient permission. What our master actually did was far more complex. Using his finest tools, he carefully loosened specific sections of the copper mesh beneath, not enough to disable it entirely, but sufficient to cause irregular function. More importantly, he installed small mirrors, polished metal surfaces no bigger than a shilling, at crucial points under the table's frame. When the electromagnetic current flowed, these would create subtle but visible sparks, betraying the mechanism to any observer who knew where to look. Thomas had agreed to their plan with the desperate courage of someone who'd already lost everything worth losing. Mr. Webb had promised him immunity from prosecution and, more importantly, a position with a sympathetic manufacturer in Birmingham. Honest work at honest wages. Enough to support his family without Blackwood's tainted charity. "Tonight, you operate the device as normal," our craftsman had instructed. "But when Mr. Webb gives the signal, he'll mention the ghost of Major Pelham specifically. You increase the current to maximum. The effect will be dramatic." Sarah had pledged her assistance too, her role crucial, though seemingly mundane. She would ensure the serving door remained slightly ajar, allowing witnesses from the servants' hall to observe what transpired. The testimony of working people might carry less weight in court, but even Lord Ashworth couldn't ignore his entire household staff. The London gentlemen arrived as evening fell, their carriages gleaming with city polish. Mr. Pemberton brought 2 colleagues from the railway syndicate, men whose wealth came from iron and steam rather than land and title. They examined the billiard room with the calculating eyes of those who measured everything in potential profit. Captain Blackwood played the gracious habitué, regaling them with tales of the table's supernatural tendency. "Poor Major Pelham's spirit seems particularly active when the stakes are high," he said with practiced charm. "Perhaps he's trying to win back what he lost." Our craftsman positioned himself in his usual spot in the corridor, but tonight, Mr. Webb had arranged for him to enter if needed, for immediate adjustments should any irregularity occur, the magistrate had suggested to Lord Ashworth, who'd agreed with suspicious reluctance. The games began at 9 o'clock sharp. The London men played with urban efficiency, their shots quick and calculated. Blackwood partnered with one of them, a Mr. Sterling, whose diamond pin suggested either genuine wealth or dangerous pretension. The stakes rose rapidly, £100 a frame, then 200. Our master watched Thomas slip away at precisely 9:30, descending to the cellar with the key Hartley had reluctantly provided. The estate manager himself stood frozen in the corner, sweating despite the cool evening, trapped between exposure and compliance. The first manipulation was subtle. A ball nudged slightly off course, favoring Blackwood's position.
Sterling laughed with delight at his partner's luck, unaware he was paying for the privilege of being cheated alongside the cheater. But Mr. Webb watched with hawk-like attention, positioning himself where he could observe both the table and the floor beneath. At 10:15, young Ashford arrived unexpectedly, his face pale but determined. "I've come to settle my debt," he announced, though everyone knew he couldn't possibly have raised the money since yesterday. "Family honor demands it," he continued with dignity beyond his years, "though I must ask for terms, perhaps a year to pay." Blackwood's smile held triumph poorly disguised as sympathy. Another young gentleman trapped in his web, another steady income from someone's desperation. But Webb moved into position, catching our craftsman's eye. "Speaking of honor," the magistrate said conversationally, "I wonder if Major Pelham's ghost might appear tonight." The stakes are certainly high enough. The signal given, our master felt rather than heard the change below, the electrical hum rising from subtle to pronounced. The altered mesh began to vibrate, the loosened sections creating resistance that built heat and energy. Suddenly, blue sparks erupted from beneath the table's edges, visible in the gaslight like tiny lightning strikes. The London men jumped back in alarm. Lord Ashworth stood frozen, his face cycling through confusion, understanding, and rage. But most dramatically, the specially weighted balls began to move on their own, drawing to the edges of the table where the electromagnetic field was strongest, rolling in impossible patterns that no ghost could explain. "What in God's name?" Sterling began, but Webb cut him off with legal authority. "Gentlemen, I believe we're witnessing not supernatural intervention, but criminal fraud." He strode to the table, pointing at the visible sparks. "Electromagnetic manipulation, if I'm not mistaken, operated from below to influence these altered balls." Blackwood tried to run, but young Thomas stood in the doorway, blocking his path with the quiet determination of someone who'd chosen his side. £5 a month you paid me," the boy said clearly, ensuring everyone heard. £5 to operate your cheating mechanism while you robbed these gentlemen." The captain's handsome face contorted with rage and fear. "You dare! A footman's word against mine? Not just his word," Hartley interrupted, finding courage in collective confession. "I provided the keys under duress. Captain Blackwood threatened to expose accounting errors from my youth, errors that were honest mistakes but would have seen me dismissed without reference." The billiard room erupted in controlled chaos as the London gentlemen demanded explanations, their urban sophistication shattered by the reality of systematic fraud. Lord Ashworth stood perfectly still, his colonial administrator's training allowing him to process disaster without external display, though our craftsman noticed his hands trembling against his evening jacket. Captain Blackwood attempted one last gambit, drawing himself up with military bearing. "This is absurd. Some electrical fault in the modern wiring, nothing more. I'll have my solicitor—" "Your solicitor will be quite busy," Webb interrupted with judicial calm. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Pemberton, gentlemen, I am the county magistrate, and I assure you this matter will be thoroughly investigated. All losses from games at this table over the past months will be documented. Our master stepped forward then, carrying one of the altered balls he'd retrieved from the cellar. He placed it on the table alongside a regular ball, the difference in weight obvious when lifted. The mechanism required 3 parts, he explained with professional precision. The copper mesh beneath the cloth, the electrical apparatus below, and these specially crafted balls with iron cores. Simple physics applied to criminal purpose. Sterling picked up the weighted ball, his face darkening as he calculated his losses. 3,000 pounds I've dropped at this table over the summer. 3,000! The captain's composure finally cracked. He lunged toward Thomas with raised fists, but our craftsman intervened, his working man's strength easily restraining the cavalry officer who'd grown soft in garrison life. "The boy was coerced," he said firmly. "Blackmail makes slaves of free men." Lord Ashworth finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of imperial judgment. "Captain Blackwood, you will remain in this room while I summon the constables. Mr. Hartley, your position here is terminated, though I accept you were compromised. Thomas—" He paused, studying the young footman with new consideration. "Your confession shows courage, if not initial wisdom." Sarah appeared with perfect timing, leading a group of household staff who'd witnessed everything through the open door. Their testimony would prove vital. The butler, the cook, even the aged gardener who rarely entered the house had come to see justice served on those who'd thought themselves above it. Young Ashford stood apart, processing how close he'd come to ruin. Webb placed a paternal hand on his godson's shoulder. "Your losses are void, based on criminal fraud. You'll return to Cambridge with a story that should teach you more than any lecture on ethics." But it was Mrs. Blackwood's arrival that provided the evening's final drama. She entered unannounced, having traveled from Bath on the late train. Our craftsman had never seen her before, a handsome woman of 31, whose eyes held intelligence sharpened by disappointment. "I received a telegram," she announced, looking directly at her husband, "from Mr. Webb, suggesting I might wish to be present tonight." The captain's face went white. His wife's presence meant social ruin beyond legal consequences. The cavalry regiment would demand his resignation. The clubs would close their doors. The entire edifice of his gentleman's life would crumble. "Eleanor," he began, but she raised a gloved hand for silence. "I've known about your debts for 2 years, Reginald. I've lived in genteel poverty in Bath while you maintained your London life. But this, using your position to corrupt and cheat, this ends tonight." She turned to Lord Ashworth with remarkable composure. "I apologize for the disgrace my husband has brought to your house. Mr. Webb has explained that restitution will be required. I have a modest inheritance from my grandmother, untouched by marriage settlement. It will go toward repaying those cheated." The nobility in her bearing made the captain appear smaller, diminished like a ball rolling away from its intended pocket. He sank into a chair, the fight leaving him entirely, as constables arrived to take him into custody. Our craftsman began dismantling his mirrors and adjustments, returning the table to its honest state. Thomas helped him, the two working in companionable silence while the room slowly emptied of its drama. The young man's hands were steady now, freed from the tremor of secret knowledge. "Birmingham," Thomas said quietly. "Mr. Webb says there's good work there, honest work." "The best kind," our master agreed, tightening a final bolt. though honesty's a luxury some can afford more easily than others. The evening concluded with unexpected grace. Lord Ashworth, perhaps recognizing his own blindness to corruption in his household, announced that Hartley would receive a reference, acknowledging his years of good service before Blackwood's corruption. Young Ashford thanked our craftsman with genuine warmth, understanding that working men had risked much to save him from ruin. Mr. Webb lingered last, studying the restored table with satisfaction. "You could have simply completed your work and left," he observed. "Why involve yourself?" Our craftsman considered the question while packing his tools. "A table's only true when it's level," he finally answered. "Maybe justice should be the same, not tilted by birth or circumstance, but balanced for all who play." The magistrate smiled slightly. "A philosophy worthy of your Marcus Aurelius, though I suspect the emperor never had to adjust for electromagnetic interference." As our master prepared to retire, a letter arrived from Margaret. Peterson had set their wedding date, November 15th. "We want you to stand witness," she wrote. "Who better than a brother who understands the value of true craftsmanship?" November 1st arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes England feel eternal, though our craftsman knew better than most how quickly things could change beneath unchanging surfaces.
He stood once more in the billiard room at Ashworth Hall, summoned back not for crisis, but for honest labor. Lord Ashworth wanted the electromagnetic mechanism completely removed, the table restored to its original integrity. A month had passed since that dramatic evening. Captain Blackwood awaited trial in London, his military career already ended by resignation. Mrs. Blackwood had sold her jewelry to begin restitution, moving in with her mother while seeking respectable employment, perhaps as a governess, someone had mentioned, her education finally serving practical purpose. Young Thomas had departed for Birmingham 2 weeks prior, sending back a letter that our master now carried in his pocket. "The work is hard," the boy had written in careful script, "but the wages are mine to keep, earned honest. I'm learning the machinery trade proper. My mother says to thank you, though she doesn't fully understand what for."
Our craftsman worked methodically, removing the copper mesh strip by strip. Each piece came away like scales from eyes, revealing the original construction beneath: solid English oak, honestly joined, built to last generations without deceit. Lord Ashworth watched from the doorway, a different man from the suspicious autocrat of October. The revelation of corruption in his own household had humbled him in ways colonial service never had. "I've been blind," his lordship said quietly. "Trusted the wrong people, suspected the innocent." Our master continued working without comment. He'd learned that powerful men's confessions were best received in silence, like adjusting a delicate mechanism where too much pressure would cause damage. "Hartley's found a position in Dover," Lord Ashworth continued. "Smaller estate, but clean start. I gave him the reference he deserved for his good years, before Blackwood's poison." Sarah entered with tea, moving with new confidence. She'd been promoted to head housemaid, her intelligence finally recognized and rewarded. She set the tray down carefully, catching our craftsman's eye with a look of shared understanding. They'd both witnessed how the great game was really played, the mechanisms usually hidden beneath polite surfaces. Mr. Webb arrived in the afternoon, bringing news from London. Blackwood's trying to claim the apparatus was already there when he discovered it, that he merely failed to report it. But Thomas's testimony is solid, and Mrs. Blackwood has provided letters that suggest her husband's long planning." The magistrate ran his hand along the restored table's edge, feeling the honest wood beneath the baize. "Your metaphor about level playing fields stayed with me," he told our craftsman. "I've been thinking about justice differently, not as something handed down from above, but built from below, carefully calibrated by those who understand balance." That evening, our master took a final walk through the estate grounds. The autumn leaves created a carpet of gold and brown, nature's own baize covering the earth's imperfections. He thought about electromagnetic forces, invisible yet powerful, and how they resembled the social currents that moved men like billiard balls across the table of society. Some balls were weighted with privilege, others with desperation, but occasionally someone adjusted the table itself. A letter from Margaret awaited him in his room. The wedding plans proceeded well, she wrote, and Peterson had already cleared space in the workshop for collaborative projects. "Two craftsmen under one roof," she wrote with evident pleasure, "building a life with the same precision we bring to our trades." She'd enclosed a sketch Peterson had drawn, a design for a special clock case that would require both woodworking and mechanical expertise, their skills combined in creation rather than competition. Our craftsman smiled, remembering his father's words about finding the true level in all things. He pulled out his volume of Marcus Aurelius, opening to a passage he'd marked years ago. "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee." The emperor's wisdom seemed particularly apt. Blackwood's selfish mechanism had ultimately destroyed him, while Thomas's confession, though risking everything, had freed him for honest advancement. On his final morning at Ashworth Hall, our master made one last examination of the table. The slate was true, the baize properly stretched, the cushions responsive, everything as it should be, as the original craftsman had intended. He'd removed not just the fraudulent mechanism, but restored faith in the game itself. Lord Ashworth paid him generously, adding a bonus that would secure Margaret's wedding expenses and leave enough for workshop improvements. "You've taught me something," his lordship said, offering his hand, not the limp gesture of a superior to an inferior, but the firm grip between men who'd learned mutual respect. "That truth, like a properly set table, needs constant maintenance and adjustment." The train back to London carried our craftsmen through countryside now familiar, past the same telegraph poles and railway works, but he saw them differently now. Progress and tradition, modern forces and ancient games, all required careful balance, honest calibration. The electromagnetic apparatus had been a corruption of progress, using new knowledge for old sins. But progress itself wasn't the enemy, no more than tradition was inherently virtuous. He thought of young Thomas learning his new trade, of Sarah rising through merit rather than favoritism, of Mrs. Blackwood rebuilding her life with dignity despite disgrace. Even Hartley, freed from blackmail's weight, might find redemption in honest service. The table had been leveled, at least for a moment, in this small corner of England. As London's sooty embrace welcomed him home, our craftsman found Margaret in the workshop, carefully repairing a music box. Peterson had been teaching her the delicate work. She looked up with tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "He's asked me to be a true partner," she said. "Not just in marriage, but in the work. Says women's fingers are often steadier for the finest mechanisms." Our master embraced his sister, feeling the rightness of this new arrangement. Change was coming to England, to all their lives, but change, carefully calibrated and honestly implemented, could be as true as any billiard table he'd ever set. That night, he wrote in his journal, a habit begun after his father's death. Completed the Ashworth Commission. Table restored to original truth. Learned that some ghosts are merely men with magnets, but real spirits, honor, justice, courage, these move through the world without wires or trickery, needing only honest hands to guide them true.